we wanted this to be a sort of informal conversation. So a couple of just notes. You can expect Jonathan, who is the associate editor of PBSA, will talk about then. I'm Sarah Werner, the editor of PBSA. I will talk about now. Amanda Watson, who is a PBSA advisory board member and librarian at NYU, is going to talk about tomorrow and the future. And then we will have opportunities for conversation so we can talk together about what we think a bibliographical note can and cannot do for us. I want to mention too that this session will lead straight into the New Scholar session without a break in between. So just prepare for that. There will be a break between the New Scholars and the annual, what do we call it? The annual lecture, the big event. So I'm going to hand things over now to Jonathan.
Thank you. So it's wonderful to see also, I've been with the journal since July, and it's wonderful to see in this room so many people who are authors, peer reviewers, advisory board members, special issue editors. Thank you all for not only being here, but also your service to the society through your service to the journal. It's, as I say when I sign off my requests for your volunteerism to peer review, thank you for your time and expertise. It really can't be done without everybody. So as I came out of the journal, Sarah and I were having conversations about many things, and one of them is that if you're a reader of PBSA or an author for PBSA, you will note that we have three sections that you can that we have divided the journal into for types of work that we publish: articles, bibliographical notes, and reflections on bibliographical work. And we were having conversations about what exactly makes something an article versus a bibliographical note. How do we understand that division? Reflections on bibliographical work is another thing altogether, perhaps for next year's Bib Week. So we decided to have a conversation amongst ourselves, but also thought it'd be useful to share what do we think a bibliographical note is? And the way that I started to think about that was just to go back through the journal starting in 1904, and see what happens, see what it is. When does it emerge? What does it look like? How does it change? What are some of its features? And so I'm the ghost of Bib Notes past, and I'm going to sort of take a look at when they emerge in the journal and when they get up to about a time when they start to look like they do now, and then turn it over to the ghost of Bib Notes present. So bibliographical notes as its own section of the journal actually doesn't emerge until 34.1. So 34 years into the journal, that is the first quarter of 1940, and it announces itself here as a new section with editors Alexander Davidson Jr. and Gerald McDonald. Alexander Davidson was the librarian of the Grolier Club and served as stints as the president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and as the secretary of the BSA. I also found out that he, like me, was born in Buffalo, so there have been at least 2 editors of Bib Notes born in Buffalo. Gerald McDonald was a librarian in the information division at the New York Public Library, and then briefly, right before his death, he was the chief of special collections when that position was created in 1969. So previously, there were occasional notes in the journal. So prior to 1940, there were sections that, there'd be a section called Notes. And from what I can tell, they would be sort of correspondences with the journal or materials that the journal had received that somebody would write sort of in an editorial voice about them with a sort of royal we. So for example, in 1919, George Parker Winship compiles information that comes into the journal that he thinks people in BSA would want to know about and shares it in a long note written by himself. But it's really not until this point, 1940, that we get our first bibliographical notes as such. And here is the first one. It was originally divided up into section by type of material text. So there was a section for incunables, there's a section for Americana, there's a section for post-1500 European printed books, and that quickly goes away, but that's the original organization system, kind of like, we were talking about Ex Libris last night, right? Like, so the incunable section, the Americana section. So here's the first note from Frederick R. Goff, who was soon to be the chief of the Rare Book Division at the Library of Congress, and it provides a bibliographical description and collation formula for a 1485 Naples edition of Aesop. Goff notes that it is not found in the relevant bibliography and uses the BibNote space to let the BSA community know where it is to be found and to provide a full bibliographical description of the LOC's copy. And so this is still a function of the BibNote, even though you'll note that this is very, very brief. When this emerges in the journal, it is essentially copying the notes and queries model from English academia, essentially. So the second note, other entries share information about previously unrecorded printed works. They told PBSA readers where they could be found. They're doing very basic information sharing when this emerges in the journal. And unlike when somebody like George Parker Winship was doing the authorial voice, they're doing it from their own voice, their own perspective, and they're signing them. Some entries correct information about what the correspondent author finds wanting in existing bibliographical references or adds context about specific copies like variants in their collections. And as I said, this is very much on the notes and queries model, whose motto was, when found, make a note of it. One of the things that Sarah and I were talking about, the bibliographical note, both then and now, is that this remains a space where the impetus for the scholarship is, hey, look at this. Look, there it is. And that's very much, when this emerges in the journal, it's very much what it's doing. It's very much borrowing on the notes and queries model, information sharing, information gathering, information seeking amongst collectors, librarians, scholars, bibliophiles, and bibliomaniacs alike. There are short, informal snippets or medium-length pieces that take up 1 or 2 paragraphs, and there is a known interval between them through which you expect correspondence to happen. And in some of these, you will find people giving their address or their institutional address, their home address, and just asking for correspondence. Like, if you know anything about this, send it here, right? Which very much is coming out of notes and queries. However, by the second issue of 1940, the BibNote is already getting longer. Right, people like this right away, and it's no longer sort of a short snippet. Only we're getting longer pieces. Here, Clarence Bingham from the American Antiquarian Society moves beyond description and enumeration, getting into a sort of reasoned positing of a conclusion about a likely as yet unrecorded source text for an American variant of an English pamphlet. And we also see here the beginning of much longer notes that are kind of like dumping information. There is just a note here about what he thinks is the likely spuriousness of a manuscript, getting into print information about provenance, memorializing who said what to whom, and so on. And the writing here does remain informal and still almost painfully brief. There is definitely an emphasis on an economy of words still as these emerge in the journal. However, getting longer. By the end of the decade, we're starting to get like formal bibliographical scholarship as it emerges as a science in the American in the Anglo Academy and library scientific world. Here's Fredson Bowers doing bibliographical scholarship and reasoning in more formal writing that breathes a little bit more. Bowers here offers a 5-page note. So within a decade, we go from a single paragraph to a 5-page note on variant cancel leaves, detailing each state and elaborating on the press work that would have created them, as he posits it, as well as listing which institutions are known to have which states. The writing has become much more formal. Bowers writes, "We arrive thus." This is not something that's happening at the beginning of the decade where it's just very sparse writing. We arrive thus. There are parenthetical asides offering judgments on taste or quality. The Lehigh copy, a splendid copy, exhibits, right? That's Bowers. So what differentiates these from articles in the same issues is another question that I had, like for them in the 1940s, what makes a bib note and what makes an article? One, bib notes seem to focus only on questions of like strict bibliographical data. They lack discussion or interpretation of the visual and verbal content of the texts. They focus on brevity, like they're 5 pages long instead of 10 pages long, which is the standard sort of for an article around this time. They're not focused on biography. They're not focused on the legal or aesthetic or historical context for material text. They remain laser focused on things like press work, collation, corrections, variants, descriptive and enumerative data. For example, articles in a 1952 issue included a biography of a printer, an analysis of the effects of protective tariffs on the book trades in a particular period. So things that go into historical or biographical, squarely in the article world, and the data, stuff that's sticking with data and bibliographical reasoning, is going into bib notes. I also really like that by 1954, the bibliographical note is a place where people air grievances. So where else can you be petty and air grievances about the shortcomings of someone else's work? Finding the official errata list issued by the ALA incomplete, Earl Walbridge of the NYU Libraries offered his own 5-page edition of errata, a second errata sheet of all the errata that were missed by the original errata of the ALA. The bib note as a petty scholarly outlet. You'll see here, like, getting into, like, well, Huckleberry Finn, or as they have it, or as the history has it, Huckleberry Finn. And here, I just note that there's like a kernel of the original split between the ALA and the BSA, emerged in the early 20th century as largely male, rare books, research institution-oriented bibliographers felt themselves different from a largely feminized service-providing American library force, and I feel like some of that is still happening here in 1954. So by 1950s, by 1960, many of the bib notes start to resemble the type of bib notes that we see now. It's data, and it's organized for some reason or need that they posit, often by somebody working closely with sources, like a librarian, a collector, a seller, a researcher, and presented with a deep but yet still brief contextualization. So here on the first page, you get a sort of historical contextualization of the text that they're talking about, and also a description of the need for the list, right? And then you get bibliography as list. There's more things I could say here. There are other kinds of bibliography that appear, like bibliographies of secondary sources that will later be taken on by indexing services and things like that, but it's kind of far afield from what the bib note is to us today. So by the 1960s, I think this really seems to sort of start to coalesce around something that's familiar to us now. And I'll just note that, like, around this time, like in 1959, you could still get a PhD in an English department with a dissertation that was a bibliography, right? So here's Robert Scholes, a modernist at Brown, deceased in the last decade, was past president of the MLA, whose dissertation was a bibliography of the Joyce collection that Cornell, where he had been in graduate school, collected. And I once heard him give a talk in which he said, I'm probably the last person who got a dissertation, who could have gotten a PhD with a bibliography as a dissertation. So we have this moment in which there are multiple sort of turns happening in the Anglo Academy, which move toward interpretation, method, theory, rather than description. And so around the time that bibliography is sort of falling away as a credentialing form of scholarship in the academy, it's also starting to look in PBSA like it does today. And I think that there's maybe something there. I'm sort of conjecturing, I'm not offering a deep analysis or an argument, like giving a note, but rather saying I think there's something connected about these shifts in how scholarship is expected to be done and what counts as scholarship. But also happy to say that this still counts as scholarship within PBSA, and we're happy to be a place where this kind of bibliographical work happens. And I will turn it over to Sarah to talk about the ghost of the bib note now.
I am not as tall as Jonathan. So, bibliographical note, now we get a fair number of inquiries. We'll get submissions that are submitted as a bibliographical note, where the editors will be like, I think this is actually an article. And sometimes we get submissions of an article, and we're like, actually, I think that's a bibliographical note. And then, of course, authors want us to be able to say, well, what is a bibliographical note? How do I differentiate between the two? And the answer I'm going to give now is going to be vague, but I hope also sort of helpful. The key thing well, for one thing, there are not a lot of places to publish bib notes. So if you think that you might have something that falls in this category, Jonathan and I are very interested in seeing that from you. I think that still, as Jonathan was saying, the purpose of a bibliographical note, the purpose of it is still to say, look at this. This could be a book. This could be a series of books. This could be a collection in a library. This could be anything that centers a material text. But the look at this, which is really what we see in the early ones, also needs to be accompanied, I think, with a sort of so what? You need to be able to explain to us, the editors, but more importantly to your readers, why it matters that you found this unrecorded edition, or why it matters that there is this collection of books that is awesome in Oakland University. That's not to say that you have to make an argument about it, and this is where I think bibliographical notes can be really fun as opposed to an article. You don't have to then say, I found an unrecorded edition, and then make a big argument about this is how it came to be, this is how it got missed, and therefore, because we have this unrecorded edition that we found, we now understand that the entire meaning of Pilgrim's Progress is different. That would be amazing. I don't think that will ever happen with Pilgrim's Progress. But you do have to be able to explain to your readers why they should read that note. Why do they care that there is an unrecorded? And it could be questions. You could say, look at this thing. This gives us a chance to think more carefully about the history of printing in Greece. We had always assumed that there were no Polish-speaking printers in Italy in the 1400s. I am totally making stuff up off the top of my head for examples. We had always made this assumption, but now because we have this new object that I want to call your attention to, maybe we should rethink some of our basic assumptions. So look at this, tell us why it's interesting, and then I was really struck in looking at the early history of notes, how cryptic they are. Like, if you are not a cataloger, if you haven't studied descriptive bibliography and the system of notations that we use to describe editions, you can't make any sense of those. Whereas in a bibliographical note today, you still can include all of that information. I'm thinking of Michael Winship's bibliographical note in the Black Bibliography special issue from a couple of years ago, which is full of super useful bibliographical descriptions of early printings of, it was like 2 years ago, and an editorial time that's like a decade ago, so I can't remember the specifics of it. But it's set within, there's more space to give more context to it, to say, like, this is how I approached it, these are why I'm pulling out these elements, this is how all of this is adding up. That goes hand in hand with my real desire for our journal to be a place that both speaks to those of us who feel like we are experts in bibliography, so most of us in this room, and also is open to be understood and interesting to people who are not experts in bibliography. I really truly believe it's a little bit of a bibliographer proselytizing moment. I don't need to proselytize to you all, but we need more. There are a lot of people who are doing bibliographical work, and they do not think of it as bibliographical work. It'd be great if we were able to be in conversation with them. And so the bibliographical note, that sense of it needs to be accessible, is just part and form of sort of like the vision that we have for the journal, of it being both very scholarly and sophisticated, and also accessible to people who are just entering the field. That's the quick version of it. I would say, like Jonathan said, bibliographical notes are really maybe not the best place to air grievances. They are definitely places where you can have a disagreement with someone, but that's really different. To say this was published and this was wrong and I can tell you why is not the same thing as like snide little notes about Huckleberry, although that's hilarious that they wanted to spell Huckleberry Finn that way. So debate is good. Saying things, this is cool, is one of my favorite things in the world. Bibliographical note is a place to do that. If you have an object that you want to say, look at this, and then what you really want to do is like, look at this, and like, because of this object, I can now talk about the history of our bodies, ourselves, entirely differently, and here's what this means, and here's how I understand it. That's an article. If I just wanted to say, like, this is the process by which the first printings of Our Bodies, Ourselves were printed. I don't know why I'm using that tone of voice to talk about my research. And then that's period, the end, that's a bibliographical note. So I'm gonna let Amanda talk or ask questions, however Amanda sees fit, to talk about the unknown future.
Can you all hear me? Awesome, okay. So I was thinking about this last night, and what I ended up with was kind of a string of basically literature scholar, thoughts about the genre of the note, because that's my background and that's the kind of thing that I think about. And I was also thinking about kind of notes and queries as a model, and I'm very glad that Jonathan brought it up so that got in much more detail than I could possibly have done. And I was kind of thinking about the dual nature of what we think of as a note, either as something that is, on the one hand, potentially like very personal, very private. When you take notes on something, you don't usually think to share them. Sometimes we have a lot of famous people's notes that we like to look at, as a record of how they thought. But we often think of a note as something that is like just for us, for our own use, and we may or may not ever come back to it. But on the other hand, like, there's also the sense of note as a form of correspondence, which I think you can also see in that both notes and queries and PBSA biblionote model, especially, maybe not especially the airing of grievances, but definitely the sense that some of this is like people corresponding with each other. And one of the descriptions of notes and queries that I looked at said something about it being a kind of proto-internet, long before the internet, a way for scholars to connect with each other and exchange information and talk to each other. So there's also, there's this sort of dual public and private side of notes that I think is really interesting, especially in a format like this. And I don't really have a future of the bibliographical note thing to add on to the past and present, but what I will say is that I've also been thinking about the kind of the role of various forms of digital and social media in kind of scholarly communication and scholarly practice generally. And the fact that we're at this moment where a lot of social media platforms that maybe many of us got used to over the years have kind of imploded or turned into, Nazi bars that none of us want to frequent anymore. this is maybe something to think about. Like, what can we do with a format like the BiblioNote in an age where we might not necessarily be talking to each other on Twitter, which I refuse to call X, or similar, you know? So those were kind of my main thoughts, and I'm sure I'll have further ones.
Yours isn't on. I will note also, just for folks thinking, I want to encourage you to send us your bibliographical notes or ask us about your bibliographical note ideas. I'll also note that they are peer-reviewed, right? So these do go through peer review. For those of you thinking about, why that might matter for your career or your writing process, they're seen by peer reviewers in the same way that articles are. And are revised and get the same kind of feedback.
And so I will say that one of the things that I really like about the note genre, I really love, Amanda, what you pulled up about community through notes. And one of the things that the journal has not really done in recent years, I found one exception, is the queries part of notes and queries. We don't tend to publish, I am looking for this. Has anybody come across that? It would be, I think actually just Ex Libris. I think Ex Libris is our answer to that, so we don't need to do that anymore. But it is an opportunity for people doing lots of different types of research to be able to publish peer-reviewed work for your own heart's desire, or if you are in a sort of job that requires that. But we would love now, we have 10 minutes before we get to hear from the new scholars. Any questions, comments, thoughts? We have mics at the ready. If you'll wait, Aaron has... Can you pass? Aaron, who should also say thank you, Aaron, for all of the work that goes into today. Yes. Passing around a mic is the least of what Aaron does for us.
I'd like to make a case for getting back queries. Nowadays, and this happens every week, it's the thing on Ex Libris I enjoy the most, is when people post a query. And what is amazing to me is that they get an answer almost immediately from the right person. That's wonderful that we can do that on Ex Libris, but then it disappears into the ether. And I know it's in the archives, but we don't really look in the archives. I still go back and read 19th century editions of Notes and Queries, and it's one of my favorite sort of reading, to come across things miscellaneously, but it's also indexed. So I think that there is a case to be made for including queries in PBSA because it will be there for the future.
Thanks, Joan. I'm wondering if there's a way in which, if you have, so one of the problems with using a print journal for queries is the time delay. If it goes through peer review quickly and journal scheduling works out, it might get into print 6 months later, and that's really fast. But I think there might also be a way in which queries can be incorporated into notes, so that one of the sort of like that so what thing could be, I have found these 25 editions so far of Joan's memoir, which nobody knew that she was writing, but I'm curious, there might be more out there. Could you please let me know? And so then is really it becomes less timely and also adds to I hear you about the record and needing that.
I think outside of the 19th century form of notes and queries, the writing of them now can include just asking questions that you don't have the answer to, which is not something that we generally encourage in the article form or sort of encourage students and authors and ourselves to take out that boy, what would it mean if this was that, right? Then you show don't tell, right? But I think the bibliographical note can be a place where we're just literally asking questions about a thing, which hopefully people can answer.
Yeah, I think you see some of that in journal articles, but it's more of kind of a rhetorical, here's where I'm opening space, but I'm not expecting anybody actually answer.
To what extent do you think PBSA could coordinate with the newsletter around some of these questions, the online newsletter? Because it does seem like there's a sort of a problem with what the role that it once had versus the role that it has today, and maybe the newsletter is a better forum.
It's an interesting idea. I will say that the newsletter and PBSA are totally separate entities. So if people thought it would be an interesting idea to be able to use the newsletter to ask short queries, that would be something to be discussed with Erin McGurl, who is the editor, so to speak, of the newsletter. So I think that's a good thing that we can leave open and think about more. I cannot imagine why the journal would object to that. I think that would be great, and it could be possible that some of those queries could then turn into notes that got published in the journal. But that's an Erin question. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for telling us a bit about the history and present and future of the note. I'm curious from an editorial standpoint, what would be ideal word count for note text and notes inclusive? What do you see in terms of planning your issues? What would be a good ballpark? Thank you.
They're all so different.
That question.
They're all so different.
I think that the typical guideline that we have been saying, which is not necessarily the right answer, but I think we've been saying something like 3,000 to 5,000 words. My gut is that it really depends on what the note's about. If you're talking about how long was Sarah Hovde's? So in the current issue, right? There's a bibliographical note in it by Sarah Hovde that is not about a book. It's about these St. Dunstan editions, and she's done really interesting work talking about the publication history and who was buying them, and it opens up all sorts of questions. And I want to say it's sort of lengthy, but it wasn't too lengthy. She's not making an argument. She's really providing a lot of information in it. But I also want to say, sort of in general, I think if you're getting much above 5,000 words, you're probably heading into argument territory. So then maybe what your soul is telling you is that this isn't a note, this is an article, which is also a nice thing to discover as you're writing.
And I think there's a difference between the sort of like the writing that is the contextualization, the historicization, and the data. Because we've had appendices of bibliographical data that are long, which have massive word counts, but are appropriate to the task. It's also a space where you can be very image heavy. That's a privilege that we have in this particular journal. Sarah's wincing, but you can be maybe more encouraged with relevant images than in other spaces.
This is the last one.
Last question.
For the benefit of those watching the recording later.
It occurs to me that the traditional notes, were ways to add to a bibliography, and then it would be kind of on the record. And we don't really need that now since, for various reasons. But something that often does not get on any record is a checklist of an exhibition. And it occurs to me that the note format, especially for smaller exhibitions, which are the ones that are really not likely to have a checklist, that could be an amazing kind of note. Like, we did a little exhibition on this really unusual topic, and here are the items that we selected. I know that it might be difficult to vet those, but it does seem to me like exhibitions there's no real venue to publish. If you want to do an online exhibition or whatever, that's a whole other thing, but this just occurs to me as a really wonderful possibility for some of these really tiny things that are very ephemeral, and then they'd be on the record.
I'm not entirely convinced that that's a bib note. I do think that one place that you could share that information would be BibSite. So BibSite is, again, not connected to PBSA officially. It is another BSA publication that Eric Enzer, I don't know if Eric is here, and a team edit. And you can add your own materials to it. If you have bibsite.org, right? Is that the go to it? And actually, I think that would be a great place if people wanted to share more information that way. It's indexed. It's connected to other materials that might be relevant. I can then imagine that if I was looking to think about a certain topic, that I could go to BibSite and search and be like, this exhibition sounds exactly. So I just want to suggest BibSite is also a place that is really useful for that sort of information. It's 1 o'clock. It's time for the New Scholars. Thank you all
Thank you
for
for your
this
attention.
conversation. And just remember, anytime you want to get in touch with me or Jonathan, the easiest way to do it, our names at BibSoCamer or just PBSA@bibsocamer.org. And our wonderful managing editor, Dylan, who you'll meet later, will make sure to pass the message on. So we look forward to seeing your submissions and continuing these conversations. Thank you so much.